What makes us unhappy? What makes us dissatisfied with life? It's generally suffering. And when you break it all down, suffering can either be emotional or physical. Physical is obvious. Emotional might not be quite as obvious. But generally, fear is the biggest problem. So let's talk about resolving that in this video. In this video, we're going to talk a lot about the spiritual approach and the 3D approach to life experience. So what's the biggest and most important part of the 3D approach to life experience? It's survival. Everything that we do and everything that we are is all related to survival. We have evolved to survive. When we look across the animal kingdom, we see all kinds of survival methods. Most of them are physical in nature. They can run really fast, or they have sharp claws, or they have tough hide, or they can climb trees, or they can swim fast. There are so many different elusive and combat-ready evolutionary traits that make animals resilient in a nature environment. But what about us? We don't have most of those things at all. We only really have these big brains, and they are all about trying to solve problems in the 3D space, physically solve problems. Well, what's the best method that we have for that? Yeah, it's understanding your environment and being able to work through multiple stages to solve a problem. But we've got to go back even further, and that is, how do we even identify that there is a problem? Well, that's where the dominant emotion that we all suffer from comes in: fear. Only with fear can we even begin to identify that there are problems to be solved. And it's through fear that we try to understand all the worst possibilities, because fear is a prediction of the future. You probably already know this. You know that you can't be afraid of something that's already happened. You can't even really be afraid of something that's happening. You move into being afraid of what's going to happen as a result of current circumstance. Well, what's the method that we use to figure out how bad things are going to be? We imagine. We imagine every possible scenario. It could be this bad. It may not be all that bad. It may be kind of in the middle bad. This is helpful, but the most helpful approach is actually to go to that one that is the worst possible situation. If we can imagine the worst scenario, then we can put these brains to use to try to solve that worst scenario. This is why our fear predictions are so dire. When we get worried, when we have fear, when we have anxiety about some sort of situation that's coming up, we almost always imagine the worst possible scenario. Well, this doesn't work very well from our mental health standpoint. Because if all we're doing is walking around imagining the worst thing that can happen, our current now that we're living in is pretty miserable compared to something that hasn't even happened yet. How good are we at predicting the future? We have the ability to see really well. We have the ability to smell fairly okay. We have the ability to hear pretty well. And those senses are all tuned into hearing and understanding, feeling, and seeing the now. Nothing about seeing around corners even. So that means we just have to guess. So let's get this straight. You're feeling miserable because you're guessing that something bad is going to happen. And we know that the spiritual perspective to life on this planet is as far away from the survival mindset as humanly possible. So if the most important approach to life from the 3D perspective is survival, then I ask you, what's the most important approach to life from the spiritual perspective? Some might say lessons. We're here to learn lessons. I think that's a very valid approach, and I think it's very healthy to look at it in that way. However, I do see some problems because you can make yourself miserable if you can't figure out the lesson, or you can end up understanding things with a lesson that isn't as helpful or may take you down a path that is less spiritual and more 3D. Another one you might say would be, oh, it's all about what my mission is. I came here with a mission and I need to accomplish that mission. Absolutely. But there's still a possible problem with this because you can stress yourself out about trying to figure out what your mission is. And I've definitely seen this before. And that's why I say this instead. We're just here to have the experiences. And when we're talking about the experiences, we don't want to leave anything out. From a spiritual perspective, we want to experience the highs and the lows. We want the full 3D experience. We don't want to cheat our way and just only have the highs. We need all of it. The duality of this world requires it. Otherwise, we can't appreciate the highs if we don't have the lows. So let's take a look at this fear experience from the spiritual perspective. From the spiritual perspective, we invite the fear experience in. We invite all experiences in for that reason. Even if you believe that it's for lessons, then yes, you want to invite the negative in so that you can learn the lesson. If you believe that you're here to do some sort of incredible mission, the negative experiences can lead you to that incredible mission. So you don't want to dismiss the negatives for any of the spiritual reasons that you might be here. But let's compare the 3D experience from the spiritual experience in another way. What is the major difference between the 3D and the spiritual experience? Well, we're back to survival. The 3D believes that it can die. The spiritual knows that it cannot. The spiritual perspective knows that we're infinite, and the 3D perspective knows that we're finite. Okay. So what's the other big difference? It's the 3D being that can really experience the suffering. The spiritual being can't even come close to experiencing the suffering at the same way that a 3D being can. And another way to say this is, as a spiritual being, because you know that you cannot die, fear isn't really available to you because fear is a survival emotion. So the spiritual perspective is, wow, I don't get to experience fear. The only place I get to experience it is if I become one of these 3D beings. That sounds interesting. I'd like to try that on for size because I know that I'm infinite, so I don't need any fear at all. Let me try that and see what it feels like. Experience it for all the positives and the negatives. But you're watching this video not to say, oh, good, now I'm just going to be okay with my fear. And I don't really want my fears to end. I want them to keep going. Come on, fears. Let's think of some more. Let's create some more. Let's make myself really miserable. Let's really suffer. Thanks, Xane. Good job. That's not why you're here. You're here to bring that spiritual perspective to your fear experience. And that can be accomplished in many different ways. I want you to bring 8 things, 8 thoughts and concepts every time you have a fear. I mean, are you going to remember to do all 8? No, but right now you can picture one of your biggest fears and let's try applying all 8 of these perspectives to that. The first one, you are actually infinite. This 3D experience is the finite one. And then after it's over, you return to your spiritual infiniteness. Number 2, everything happens for you, not to you. Everything is an opportunity for you to learn, to expand, to grow, to discover your spiritual gifts, to have incredible experiences, both the highs and the lows. Number 3, you chose this 3D experience to have it, both the good and the bad. Number 4, your biggest fear probably won't even happen. You've imagined the worst case scenario, and especially that. Maybe a minor version of your worst case scenario might happen, but probably not even that. We predict the worst so that we can be prepared for anything. But most of the time, that imagination is a big waste of time and energy because it doesn't come true. Number 5. Even if it does happen, you will persevere. You'll grow. You'll expand. You'll be ready for the next thing, whatever it might be. And it won't turn out to be as bad as you thought. Number 6, if it were to happen and you've persevered through it, you also know, as from a spiritual perspective, that all of these things happen to make way for something greater. So if you're holding on to something that you don't want to change, or you want something to change and it doesn't happen, in every case, you are always presented with something better, newer, cooler, more amazing than you would have been able to achieve if the previous paradigm had continued as it was. Number 7, the spiritual perspective comes like this. Fear is a choice. You are choosing to fear, and you can choose not to fear. That sounds easy, I realize. But there are methods, there are approaches that you can take to overcome any fear that you have. And this week's healing session does just that. So you can check that out, and I'll make a link for it right here for you. Number 8, choosing to fear is a choice to create suffering for yourself. If we go all the way back to the beginning of the video, the major suffering that we have is related to fear. If fear is a choice and we choose not to fear anymore, well, guess what? We're not going to suffer nearly as much. So it requires that you take an active approach to releasing your fear. And maybe the 9th one should be, you know what? You can go ahead and fear all that you like. You don't have to stop it. You don't have to do anything. You can actually relax into your fear and say, hey, I'm here to experience it all, including the fear. So let me experience it at its fullest. Let me appreciate it for the experience that it is. Then guess what? It's not going to feel nearly as bad. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope it helped you. And like I said, check out the healing session. I think you'll find it to be even more helpful. And if you combine the two, you take these approaches with you into that session, you're going to really notice a big difference. I love you unconditionally. And I'll see you in the next video.